You know, Succession is a lot like dry texting on a dating app, even though it has a fun bio. It's perfectly inoffensive and serviceable until you slip up and reveal the location of the body. And I am very aware that I'm not going to make many friends by saying this, but I don't think Succession is that great. I understand that this just could be the beginning of my Joker arc, but I really don't get the hype surrounding this show. Sure, there are some good moments here and there, and I think it's really good that a largely dialogue-driven show has a rabid cult following behind it, but I can't help but feel that the show is one giant allegory for flatlining. As from this point onwards, I will be spoiling the entirety of seasons 1, 2, and 3. And if you can't be bothered listening to actual criticism, then I will put an arbitrary rating on the screen that doesn't really capture my opinion, but can be angrily quote-tweeted very easily. Since I'm pretty much going to be spending most of this video burying Succession in a ditch somewhere, let me list some things that I actually liked. Probably my favourite scene was Kendall's appearance on TV defending his dad at the beginning of season 2, as it was quite well executed and delivered on the premise of a Greek tragedy colliding with the media world. I liked the vote of no confidence scene in season 1, I liked the dinner discussion between Kendall and Logan in season 3, I liked Shiv trying to get this woman to back down from a testimony, I liked the uncut gems man on ATN, but the rest was just fine. It's the same kind of fine that plagues superhero films where it's not bad enough to be funny, nor is it good enough to be engaging. It just sits in a forgettable, blurry middle ground where you can't tell when one mediocre thing begins and the other ends. And I can't help but think of that one Yahtzee quote where he surprisingly doesn't say cock.
While I was writing down the obvious candidates, Days Gone, Ghost Recon, I suddenly noticed Anthem on the list of 2019 releases and thought, I completely forgot about that. And that, viewers, is what gives you the edge in a mediocrity contest.
Which is unfortunate considering that I really like Jesse Armstrong's previous work on The Thick of It, Peep Show, and In the Loop. So after slogging through 30 hours of the show alongside my mum, we ended on the simple question: was this supposed to be comedic? Well, according to anonymous people on the internet that also want to steal my kidneys in exchange for an iPhone 4, yes. The show is a dark satirical comedy on excess greed in corporate America, which is totally original and never been done before. And my response to this is, where is the funny? I am a very big fan of dark comedies. Hell, my favorite comedy is The Lobster. You know, that film where a woman tries to kill herself because no one will date her except she fails and ends up screaming in a pool of her own blood? Yeah, that film. But the entire time I watched Succession, I just wish I was watching something like Spaced, or Dark Place, or Utopia, or that show the creator worked on as a writer that's infinitely better than Succession. Because the show really likes to hit the same comedic beats over and over again. To which I have to say, Kendall's cringe compilation is not funny. Roman sardonicism is just Malcolm Tucker, but not funny. Shiv's Gone Girl impression is not funny. Brian Cox yelling was only funny in adaptation. Greg being Ollie is not funny. Tom's NSFW talk is not allowed in Maine. Now, dark comedy doesn't mean it's always trying to be edgy. By its definition, it's consistently navigating between laughter and distress, keeping an audience in the dark to where a given scene will tonally fall. Succession only really does this in concept. You can tell what the writers are trying to achieve with pretty much any given scene, but given it's an American team with a different director every episode, the tone and genre of the show is wildly inconsistent and entirely shallow in comedic satire, as it largely boils down to rich people bad. Isn't it so funny that this character wants to become president because he has ego? Isn't it so funny when Kendall raps because he has ego? Isn't it so funny when Roman says something problematic because he has ego? Now, I will address the dramatic beats when I get to the characters because they are so desperately intertwined. But in terms of the comedy, the foundations are there, but the execution deserves execution. Succession's structure is an amalgam of episodic and miniseries structuring, but only manages to include the pitfalls rather than its benefits. Each episode feels too self-contained and isolated from the previous episode to have any feeling or importance in the larger story, while simultaneously having the miniseries problem of constantly needing to raise the stakes and escalate the quote-unquote wildness of the show. You know, I get that subtlety and excess don't exactly go hand in hand, but I don't think the ball on the floor scene really improves nor shows anything we haven't seen before. If anything, it just hammers home how Americanized this series is. Americanized is becoming an increasingly prominent critique to describe Western media that is very loud and obnoxious, seemingly designed so audiences can just vacuum their house whilst the show is on in the background. Americanized is typically used in conjunction with remake and adaptation. The US remake of Utopia is the penultimate example of this. Utopia actually adds as a neat comparison to Succession, as the show is created by a British sitcom writer, yet executed by Americans. And even if you know nothing about media criticism, you have more than likely heard the drastic contrast in American comedy versus British comedy. One is Will Ferrell screaming, and the other is awkward silences and mumblecore dialogue, which, to put it lightly, is a bit of a contrast. Most of the time, the show is able to pull off a really great dialogue scene, but there is a lot of times where a scene will take an unnecessarily hard right turn into heightened fictional nonsense. Someone has to get punched, crash a car, do all the drugs in the world, or get into a screaming match where you could substitute all the actors' lines with "fuck you," and it would pretty much turn out the same. But Ben, or one of you, are currently saying, don't you write dialogue that amounts to variations of "fuck you"? Isn't that bluntly hypocritical? Yes. Yes, it is. But there is a difference between a Will Ferrell screaming match and weaponizing character history to contextualize a "fuck you." Take this moment from The Celebration, which Succession really took a few too many influences from but forgot to include all of the interesting bits. The context for this "fuck you" is the mother giving a monologue on how her children are all failures, and that Christian, who has made some allegations towards his father, is a liar.
I 1974 kom du, min mor, ind på kontoret og så din søn på alle fire, og du så din mand uden bukser på. Undskyld, at du kom til at se din søn sådan. Undskyld også, at din mand bad dig om at forsvinde, og at du uden tøven gjorde det. Undskyld, at du er så forløgn og forrådnet, at jeg håber, du dør af det. Og undskyld, at de alle sammen er sådan nogle svin, at de bare...
This isn't to say simply writing "fuck you" into your script as a response is a bad thing. It's a natural response, but if you really want to pwn someone on the internet, all you need to do is pull up their browser history. I just wish that the show didn't have to resort to eye-rolling extremes like bore on the floor that completely nullify the surrounding dialogue, because at times, it's pretty good dialogue. Another endless fiery hole that the show falls into is the lack of sympathy for any character. But Ben, or none of you are asking at this point because you all clicked off, they are all meant to be anti-heroes that cross moral boundaries but are all likable on the inside. And to that I say, this is true. In concept. Anti-heroes require very specific attention to detail that create an understandable moral grey area. Travis Bickle attempts political assassinations, has deep-seated racist views, kills pimps, but is also an outcast loner trying to fit in but not knowing how. He's a walking contradiction that goes on numerous diatribes about the filth of the city, only to do the exact same. Travis only really becomes outwardly dangerous when the loneliness, rejection, and hatred of his perceived filth reaches a tipping point. He is both victim and perpetrator, and that makes for a compelling anti-hero that can stand the test of time. His eventual unsympathetic actions and ideologies are born from sympathetic experiences and emotions that are universally understandable. At first glance, Kendall seemingly fits into this category. He wants to take down his father, who is responsible for corruption and sexual assault on the cruises, and just generally being a shitty person. But Kendall is also using this takeover for his own selfish, egotistical gain of becoming the next CEO. And in that, you might have already seen the problem. It's the inverse of Travis Bickle. Kendall's actions are sympathetic to a certain extent, but are born from unsympathetic experiences and emotions that are relatable to less than 1% of the world's population. The supportive argument here is that it is an intentional subversion designed for the audience to question how they could align with someone on an ideological level but whose motivations are deeply rooted in narcissism. My counter-argument is simply put, I hold no emotional investment in Kendall or any of these characters to begin with. Emotional connection needs to be established first before you delve into moral greyness. It's what challenges the audience. Taxi Driver doesn't open with Travis Bickle running someone over in his taxi. Even his first encounter with the politician, he isn't entirely aggressive. He makes some valid arguments about the city. It's only through the self-destructive victim and perpetrator arc that Travis becomes a literally me character. In contrast, Kendall is established as a successful corporate-driven man that neglects his children and ex-wife like he is the writer of this show. and he clearly has daddy issues. He then relapses in season 2, which acts as the fall from grace arc, but he never was in a morally righteous position, nor did he hold that ideology. And the result is not a Sopranos level conflict in the audience, it's that I don't feel attached to this character in any way, shape or form, so why should I care about him? And if you are going to go the route of making an unlikable main character, the main character could at least be interesting. Johnny in Naked and Alexia in Titan are basically two irredeemable main characters, but they at least express interesting sociopolitics. And at least Alexia fucks a car. Cousin Greg is very clearly established as the straight man, a way for the audience to ease into the narrative as Greg is the socially awkward outsider with the heart of gold. A perfect audience surrogate. Yet the level of writing more or less mimics 50 Shades of Grey here. It is one thing to have a character that has barely one iota of intellectual thought, but can't verbally express it due to social anxiety or awkwardness. It is a completely other thing to have a character that doesn't understand the concept of blackmail, or that a multi-million-dollar conservative conglomerate is likely to do shady practices. Oh, he also doesn't know how to read a news article. What makes this character even more infuriating is how he doesn't learn anything. He doesn't become more cunning or confident. In the 30 hours of this show, he doesn't change. Shiv begins as the most interesting character of the show. The reason I joke about her basically being someone who would say she is literally me in reaction to Gone Girl is due to the first season really wanting her to have an icy exterior with the calculated cunningness of Amy Dunn. Her involvement in media commentary allows for a character to naturally express criticisms of politics, corporatized news networks, and media conglomerates because it is her character's profession, which she is repeatedly shown to be not only hardworking but also the best at. From a script writing perspective, you have the perfect vessel to communicate ideas and concepts to the audience without obnoxious exposition. But the show rarely uses her skills and knowledge to solve problems or shut people down, which is in direct contrast to how the Social Network utilizes a similar character.
I've been licensed to practice law for all of 20 months, and I could get a jury to believe that you planted the story about Eduardo and the chicken. Watch what else. Why weren't you at Sean's sorority party that night?
You think I'm the one that called the police?
Doesn't matter. I asked the question, now everybody's thinking about it. You've lost your jury in the first 10 minutes.
The majority of Shiv's dialogue is indistinguishable from the other siblings, which could be symbolic of how the Roy family is all one and the same, but I can't imagine giving less of a shit. Because her character becomes so watered down as the show goes on to the point that you could write it out of the show entirely and it would even affect the A-plot. Roman is one of those characters that, depending on the writing and performance, can either be very good or fall flat on its face. And luckily, Kieran Culkin is a very talented actor that can elevate the Life is Strange-esque dialogue to a plane that feels natural. You always get the sense that it's the character being sardonic and hyperbolic rather than the actor trying to be as extreme as possible. But I think the best aspect of his character is his arc, beginning as sarcastic but more aloof, and slowly becoming more like his father through aggressive business strategies while still maintaining the hypersexualized sarcasm. It's the one character arc that really benefits from the medium of TV, as the arc is spread out enough to feel like a natural progression. Arguably the best scenes in the show are the three siblings interacting, with Roman on one extreme of an argument and Kendall on the other, with Shiv operating as a middle ground. And instead of portraying Roman as a mustache-twirling right-wing extremist incapable of rational thought, the writing and acting allows their arguments to come through as ruthless but reasonable, even though sympathy for the actual character themselves isn't there. Brian Cox does his best Cameron Mitchell impression.
He is half asleep, he's half passed out, he does not move through the whole movie. They cut to him and he's just in a chair.
He's always in a chair.
He's always like half asleep and he doesn't know where he's at.
Probably so they could kind of like tie him to the chair so he
to make sure he doesn't
fall over
yeah.
or something.
So that had nothing to do with anything.
Well, now it's gonna.
Oh my God. That's where Cameron wants to sit today.
Tom is fine. I honestly have nothing to say about the character because every scene with him is the same. He gets gaslit by wife, beats up Greg, repeat ad nauseum for 30 hours. There are also a lot of side characters that are serviceable in that they are comedic relief, but the actors are just horrible. Social Sailorism's acting is pretty cringe, the stepmother feels like a Disney villain, apparently the sister from Raw was in one episode or something, which is upsetting to hear because Raw is one of my favorite films. Stellan Skarsgård wasn't great, but I blame that on the script and direction. But what's important to note about these side characters is how flat they are. They never stop feeling like they serve a script's purpose over being actual characters that exist in the diegetic. A minor thing that I also find annoying is how the show really likes to think it's edgy in its portrayal of sex on screen. First of all, it's not nymphomaniac, short bus or shame, and secondly, you were telling me that white heterosexual sex scenes that barely show any nudity nor the focal point of the actual scene are boundary pushing? Do I really need to explain that? Stripping the show down to a bare bones level, pretty much every scene is people meeting in a fancy room and talking about their relationships or business. And across 30 hours, this can wind up feeling repetitive if you're not engaged in the relationships or business pursuits, especially when the same exact beats are hit with very little added emotion or intellectual weight. Kendall's drug abuse in season 2, Tom's anxiety about going to jail in season 3, Shiv's wanting of a non-monogamous marriage could all easily be cut down whilst maintaining their plot and character importance and improving the pacing of the show. Yet by far the strangest decision of the show is the repeated cutting of actual business negotiations. The aforementioned concern of Tom going to jail? Well, they just made a phone call and sorted it out all off camera. This happens numerous times and further makes the show incredibly hollow and frustrating to watch. I know this is a very film bro thing to say, but let's contrast a heavy business talk scene in Succession with The Social Network. On a bare bones level, you have the present deposition room and the past meeting with Sean Parker. The intercutting of both scenes is motivated via the deposition being a recount of the meeting, so it's not just existing for exposition or pacing purposes, but it's also a neat way of externalizing the internal monologue of Eduardo so he controls the narrative. And because of these two scenes colliding together, we get multiple conflicts. The meeting has Mark's admiration for Sean, Eduardo's jealousy of Sean, Sean's attempt to wedge himself into the company, add on to that the deposition of Eduardo's hurt from Mark's betrayal, and Mark's realization that he has been played by Sean. The Fincher trademark style is easily recognizable in the relentless editing and precise compositions, but it works in tandem with Sorkin's ping-pong dialogue, even using leading lines to motivate the cuts between scenes.
A psychiatrist would say that he was paranoid.
They'll hire private detectives who follow you day and night.
And then he cut around to the Facebook.
So, tell me about your progress.
Further add on to that Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's incredibly kinetic score and you have one hell of a scene. What makes Succession even more frustrating is how the writers completely drop seemingly important conflicts and details. Kendall's ex-wife is completely absent from season 2, his children are non-fucking existent even though season 1 clearly showcased a desire for Kendall to be closer to them. Roman's relationship with various non-intimate girlfriends, that seems like it's a setup for a desire for true intimacy conflicting with these narcissistic persona, is just entirely dropped with no explanation. Greg's mother purely exists for exposition but is never brought up again beyond season 1. Shiv's fling and connection with opposing political opponents is pushed to the sideline until the writers remembered it took up a large portion of season 2 and is given one single scene to interlink into the A-plot in season 3. And the result of all these dropped arcs, conflicts and relationships is a lack of direction for its story and characters, further bleeding into the inconsistency in structure as the show does not feel like a mapped out story where cause and effect of B-plots intertwine into the A-plot and emotional arcs of the characters. Instead, Succession feels like a sitcom trying to milk as many episodes as it can, ignoring continuity and basic fundamentals of storytelling in favor of obvious repetition, resulting in a show that feels like none of the writers were actually collaborating whilst writing their singular episodes. It's honestly impressive that the show is able to feel both repetitive and incoherent, probably an allegory for bipolar which would at least explain the comparisons to Shakespeare, because you would have to be as stable as Bitcoin to make those comparisons in the first place. But to indulge in your fantasies without a professional for a second, this show is Shakespearean in how it flips between love and hate with no middle ground, like someone forgot to take the meds. Admittedly, I wasn't raised on a steady diet of Shakespeare, mainly because I'm already concerningly skinny and require something with a little more substance, but the biggest reason is that having two constant emotional extremes that are only motivated by the big god himself feeds into the cycle of repetition, as I can pretty much always guess where a scene is going to go. And if I'm surprised by something, it's because some forced bullshit miraculously happened, which is aligned with God being God, I guess. This is probably going to be my most contentious opinion, but I really don't think the visual style of the show works at all. Now apparently the show's style is supposed to be a homage to Thomas Vinterberg's The Celebration, which is a film I really love, but if that's the case, it's a really poor homage. For those who didn't waste money on an arts degree, The Celebration is a part of the Dogma 95 movement, which was founded by Vinterberg and von Trier. It was a movement that aimed to create authentic cinema through stripping down as much artificiality as possible. No artificial lighting setups, no non-diegetic music, only handheld camera, cinema verite style, etc, etc. At first glance, Succession is seemingly paying a homage to this through its documentary approach, but the show doesn't go far enough in using the grammar of documentaries to feel authentic. Beyond the zooms and noticeable focus pulls, the celebration also uses mini DV cameras. All of the audio is recorded in principal photography, which is constantly peaking and occasionally cuts off with an edit. There is constant jump cuts, continuity errors, breaking of the 180-degree rule, breaking of the 30-degree rule, and images that are often underexposed or overexposed. The result is the feeling of a home video that a family member was recording. Its roughness and filmic restrictions creates authenticity. In contrast, Succession only really uses zooms and focus pulls, which makes the comments on the show's cinematography as inviting you to a seat at the table entirely disingenuous, as it does not feel amateur but overproduced. The way some scenes are even shot wind up feeling like you're spying on the characters, like it's a Jason Bourne film. Am I supposed to feel like I'm on a wheelie chair in this scene? The show then completely ditches the faux documentary style at random in favour of being a bland conventional drama, full of A-B shot reverse shot with the occasional master for conversations and ripping off the West Wing for a walk and talk. And I would talk more about how boring the style is, but it genuinely hurts my cold dead heart to even think about it. Because of Succession's inconsistent visual grammar, scenes don't have the emotional weight they could have through contrasting compositions or visual motifs. Even in scenes where handheld cinematography could be very effective, like Kendall's breakdown at his birthday or Logan's icy exterior crumbling, I feel nothing because there's no visual difference between that and a business conversation in hushed tones. If the show was entirely aiming to be faux documentary, then it failed. But if the goal was to create a hybrid between conventional film grammar and the documentary techniques, then Succession achieves this but in a very bland and forgettable way. The show is not as stylized as Utopia, Mr. Robot, or Euphoria, which isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but certainly makes it less memorable. Not to gloat, but I can remember a lot of useless information, like how certain scenes in films were shot, their visual beats, how the camera moved, the composition, and even precise editing points. I can barely remember any shots in Succession. There was that one shot of Kendall looking over the railing, I guess, which is a metaphor for me watching the show. That was kind of memorable. Contrast that against Mr. Robot. Its style is immediately recognizable as the Mr. Robot style, with lower quadrant framing, static tripod shooting, and that thing where characters start in mid-shot but then walk into their close-up. On top of that, each season has identifiable color tones and lighting styles that don't break the established continuity but bring something new to the table. But what makes Mr. Robot more distinct is the motivated deviations in its style. The 90s sitcom episode, the faked one episode, and the no dialogue episode, just to name a few. Even down to a scene-to-scene level, Mr. Robot is able to flex different techniques while still making it feel distinctly Mr. Robot. The hip-hop montages, Elliot's monologues, handheld one-ers, fantasy sequences, the moment where they cut the audio.
Isn't that better?
Changing aspect ratios, changing frame rates, changing the entire genre of the score. Hell, even the title sequence gets memorable iterations. And what's important to note here is that these aren't simply done for the sake of being different and quirky, but are motivated by characters and story. Similar to the non-chronological structure in season 1 of The Witcher, Succession cinematography really just comes off as being different for the sake of being different, with no diegetic motivation, but the non-diegetic motivation of it's what the thick of it did and that show is successful. Not only that, but it feels entirely out of touch. Like, have you seen how modern day documentaries look? If none of what makes the medium of film and TV is being utilized in a creative way, then why is it even being used in that medium? If the editing and cinematography don't matter, then why isn't the show just a radio play or a book? Many of my favorite films and TV shows literally could not be the same if adapted into another medium, because the language of the medium is so deeply intertwined into the story and themes. There would be so much drastic changes in order to fit into the new medium, which result in an entirely new text but with a similar premise. I honestly think the show would be more effective with a similar visual style to Birdman. Not in the sense of faking every episode to look like one continuous shot, but shooting each scene in longer takes with a free-flowing camera that goes between close-ups of the ensemble cast, instead of just standard boring shot reverse shot with the occasional master. This change in style would also aid the show's shifting perspectives and shifting alliances, as the character shot is no longer defined by them but is an amalgam of all of them. The edit points could signal a revelation, whilst a whip pan from one character to another could easily communicate a jarring disruption. It would actually make me feel like I'm a part of the conversation instead of just spying on someone with a zoom lens. This style would also be more in line with the theatricality and absurdity that the show likes to delve into. Fuck it, go full Birdman and have a percussion-based score. Speaking of poorly worded segues though. While Succession is not my favourite Nicholas Britell score, it's a very well composed and appropriate score, but it loses a lot of its punch when it gets repeatedly spammed in season 1. I also wish the score was either utilised in a way that added to actual dialogue or completely absent altogether, instead of an exclamation mark at the end of a scene. Ironically, the show that wants to lurk in the shadow of the thick of it forgot to notice that there isn't actually any music in that show at all, which aided to the lo-fi documentary feel, by not constantly distracting the audience with an unhinged Vivaldi playlist. Now obviously the contrast of classical feeling piano with punchy percussion is symbolic of the traditional hierarchy clashing with modern day sociopolitics, but I wish the score had a lot more variety. Like, look at how versatile Utopia's score is without fully breaking its established continuity. Christabel Tapia de Vere, let me have you babies. Shows that revolve around media conglomerates or heavily feature media as a storytelling device typically won't use company or person's names because it will land both the show, its creators, and its distributors in lots of legal trouble. So shows will typically use as fictional substitute with some not so subtle parallels to real-world people, companies, and events. This is what Succession does, which is not a bad thing, but considering how both the diegetic and non-diegetic portray itself as an edgy expose, I find it incredibly weak that the show doesn't do anything ballsy. Season 2 episode 1 of Utopia integrates real-world political assassinations and events into a fictitious plot about the UK government basically committing genocide through vaccines. The episode frequently uses interludes of real-world news footage, including but not only limited to the winter contingency, the assassination of Richard Sykes, nuclear meltdowns, and mass worker strikes, all of which are recontextualized by the show's creators to be entangled in the fictitious political conspiracy. And this is coming from a show that already landed in hot water for season 1 episode 3's opening of a school shooting, but the creators continued to push boundaries. On a similar note, Mr. Robot continually integrated US politics into its plot about wealth redistribution. The election of Donald Trump is contextualized as a result of F Society's Robin Hood attempt to redistribute wealth, whilst companies like E Corp are fictitious amalgams of real-world companies like Google and Amazon. The show still includes criticisms of those companies.
Like most pics people post on Instagram or Facebook, they don't realize they just gifted whatever social media site their camera type, phone model, name, and location.
The show even manipulates real-world presidential speeches to serve its fictional plot, and the show creators further constructed multiple ads for E Corp.
Together, we can change the world with E Corp.
Evil Corp.
All of these examples are both providing criticism of real-world politics, media conglomerates, and contemporary ideologies, but beyond that they serve as grounding the fictional conflicts, companies, and concepts into something believable. Succession doesn't do any of this. Like, wouldn't it be darkly funny if Roman had to hijack one of the movies he was producing and turn it into a propaganda movie for how Waystar totally didn't sexually assault those people? It could poke fun at production companies like Happy Gilmore for basically disguising giant advertisements as movies, as well as poking fun at how conservative media spokespeople basically produce propaganda. Or what if there was a fake out ad break featuring other HBO content and then an ad for ATN? It could even have one of the Rose siblings narrating it, kind of like the fake ad in Mr. Robot.
When the world feels off balance, we look to those who've stood with us from the beginning. Since 1884, we've had America's back. We may get knocked down, but we'll never get knocked out. Still on your side.
And before you comment the one instance of the show having an ounce of creativity, I would like you to bear in mind that having one scene where something marginally interesting happens doesn't make up for how bland the other 30 hours of the show are. Just because you put some nice tomatoes in a sandwich doesn't make up for the stale bread and undercooked chicken. As much as I am being negative on this, I want to like this show. I want nothing more than a well-written, high-stakes family drama entangled in a media conglomerate. But will I watch season 4? Probably not. As much as I want this show to be good, I can't maintain a positive thought about it without several asterisks. Contrary to my perception of relationships, this is some irreversible damage that even if the show revealed that the first 3 seasons were a fictional show created by Waystar, I still probably wouldn't take its hand in marriage. However, I do believe that Jesse Armstrong can make good shows. Hell, The Thick of It is one of my favourite shows ever, and Peep Show is rightfully a cult classic. So if you're a genuine fan of Succession, then I implore you to watch The Thick of It and The Celebration. And if you haven't seen Succession but watched this video anyway for some reason, then I would probably recommend any other comedy drama like Savages, The Dirties, In the Loop, Anomalisa, Trainspotting.
I'm bored of this. I'm going for a Twix.